The assembly line smelled of oil and fear, a hot metallic breath that clung to the overalls of men who knew their work might be counted in hours instead of years. From the first steel plate stamped to the last turret ring bolted, the Panther carried within it a contradiction, an advanced weapon born from tactical necessity and national shortage, magnificent in isolation and impossible in the ecology of a collapsing war machine. That contradiction is the through line of this story, how a tank that could dominate a battlefield became chronically absent from them, not because it failed in combat, but because the state that made it could not keep it alive. When the Panther rolled out in the summer after the great defeats on the Eastern Front, its silhouette promised a new order. Crews spoke in reverent, exhausted tones about the long, high-velocity gun, the sloped armor that deflected rounds with a cruel geometry, the sense of confidence a platoon felt when its lead tank held. Yet, the very design choices that made it formidable were also the seeds of its attrition. Engineers, pressed by emergency and pride, borrowed from aircraft practices, from precision machine work that demanded tolerances no longer assured by Germany's dwindling steel reserves and scattered workshops. Hidden in those tolerances were the first of the smaller betrayals. Brittle turret rings that cracked under shock, heat-treated gears that fractured when alloy composition varied down the supply chain. On the reading bench, an officer would find service reports that read like a slow-motion tragedy. A Panther arrives in the field with a smashed final drive after crossing a cratered road. Another loses a steering gear because the ball bearings supplied were of the wrong grade. Yet another sits smoking because the engine's oil pump cavitated in cold Russian mud. The men who fired its gun and slept inside its hull were visceral about these failures. They learned to cross country like mechanics, to unbolt hubcaps with trembling fingers after a night patrol, extracting spare idler wheels or scavenging rubber rings from wrecked trucks. And when stories hardened into habit, entire companies began to practice cannibalism, the stripping of disabled Panthers to keep a handful operational. This was not improvisation in the romantic sense, it was arithmetic. Parts in, parts out. A diminishing bank account of tanks. Bombing made arithmetic a cruelty. Allied air power, which targeted Germany's transportation and steelworks with a cold efficiency, seeded another layer of scarcity. Rail yards, vital for moving heavy components, became smoking skeletons. A Panther could be built only so far as its complex components could be transported. One lesser-known shock was the hammer blow to bearing and gear production. Ball bearings, gearbox shafts, and precision-cut splines relied on machine tools that sat under rubble. Factories relocated, sometimes to mines or basements, but the reassembly could not restore the lost time or the lost expertise. A hidden gem here is that many of the most problem-prone Panthers were not casualties of shells, but of supply chain entropy. Unfinished turrets stacked like fallen teeth, waiting for ring forgings that never arrived. Field modifications added another wrinkle. Crews, especially on the Eastern Front, found that the Panther's engine, potent and temperamental, thirsted for fuel and fresh oil it scarcely got. It consumed supplies at a rate that collapsed logistics. Long-range raids ground to a halt not because of enemy fire, but because fuel trucks could not reach the unit. The Ardennes winter showed this truth in a brutal vignette. Tanks abandoned in quiet woods, engines silent. Crews walking back under bitter sky. Mechanically, the Panther was more akin to a high-strung sports car than to the rugged tractors that armies preferred. Without meticulous maintenance, its clutches and final drives overheated and disintegrated. Crews reported a sound like a dying animal when a final drive failed, a metallic groan that turned operational hope into the cold task of jacking and replacing a gearbox under shellfire conditions. There is an image that recurs in survivor testimony: men sitting on the glacis of a disabled Panther while aircraft scream overhead, the tank's massive barrel pointing into a sky that will not feed it. The emotional anchor here is simple: pride turned helpless. A commander who had counted on the Panther's range to hold a flank found himself retracting the line not for lack of steel, but for lack of the invisible infrastructure: trained mechanics, steady supply of fuel and lubricants, dependable machine tools that turns machines into weapons. Another hidden insight: as the war narrowed, production lines prioritized anti-aircraft guns and small arms to defend the homeland, siphoning resources from tank plants. Leadership decisions, not only bombs and battle, funneled materials elsewhere. There comes a late reveal that reframes everything. The Panther's production figures are not merely a measure of industrial capacity, but of competing priorities inside a nation at war. For every Panther that rolled out, 2 diesel generators, 3 anti-aircraft mounts, or a dozen light vehicles might be delayed or cancelled. The Wehrmacht's procurement was a zero-sum game, and as the strategic picture darkened, the Panther, demanding, precise, supply-hungry, lost the tally. Men in factories who had once taken pride in machining a perfect spline found their machines requisitioned for simpler but more immediately necessary parts. The aha lands here. The Panther was not undone only by Allied might or battlefield fate. It was a victim of strategic triage. The climax arrives in late war convoys: Panthers reluctant and scarce, crews leaning on their radios for movement orders, columns stalled by mud and lack of spare parts, then strafed as they lie vulnerable. In those moments, the ideal of the tank as decisive tool dissolves. A lone platoon might fight with brilliance, but across the front the absence of replacements, the lack of trained repair crews, and the attrition of precision components meant victories could not be consolidated. The Panther, magnificent in single engagement, could not create mass effect when its numbers were amputated by logistical failure. When the guns finally fell silent and the remaining Panthers were left to rust or be towed into museum gardens, the lesson was stark. A weapon's value rests inside a network: tracks and torches, railheads and refineries, skilled hands and steady supplies. The last image a crewman would keep was not of a triumph, but of a bench and a sweat-streaked face, turning a bolt on a tank that would never move again. That is the reason the Panther could not stay on the line. Brilliance without sustainment becomes theater, not war. Decades later, in museums with polished turrets and kindly placards, visitors admire lines and armor. But beneath the metal lies the harder truth. The war was won and lost as much in workshops and rail yards as on any battlefield. And the finest tank in the German inventory was ultimately a casualty of the system that made it. If you enjoyed this, tap like and subscribe. It really helps. And drop a quick comment telling us where you're watching from: the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world. Your reply helps the video reach more people just like you.